The cracked streets of Millbrook reflected the fading afternoon sun, casting long shadows across weathered storefronts with rusted signs. Thomas Miller, a former linguistics professor now working as a janitor, stood before the imposing limestone facade of Empire Industries, the oldest company in town. While cleaning the executive boardroom after hours, he discovered a single page written in Russian referencing the Moon Project, 1972. As his eyes scanned the document, his heart began to race. Hidden within was a secret clause that could bring down an American industrial empire. The morning light had not yet broken over the hills of western Pennsylvania when Thomas Miller's alarm clock buzzed to life. 4:30 a.m. His hand calloused from years of manual labor that his doctorate in linguistics had never prepared him for silenced the clock with practiced precision. In the stillness of his modest two-bedroom apartment, he allowed himself exactly 3 minutes to remember the life he once had: lectures at Georgetown conferences in Vienna, the respective colleagues, and most painfully Sarah's smile as she'd kiss him goodbye each morning. But that was before. Thomas pulled himself from bed, his 58-year-old joints protesting with familiar aches. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way to the kitchen, careful not to wake Emily. His routine never varied: coffee brewing lunch, packed with a handwritten note tucked inside, breakfast prepared and waiting under a dish towel. Simple acts of love for his 13-year-old daughter who slept in the room next door. As he moved through the kitchen, his reflection caught in the window gray hair, cut short for practicality, deep lines etched around eyes that had once sparkled with academic curiosity, now dulled by grief and resignation. 5 years since the accident. 5 years since he'd traded tenure for a mop and bucket. 5 years of raising Emily alone. "Dad?" Emily's voice, still thick with sleep, came from the doorway. "You're making too much noise again." Thomas smiled at his daughter, her hair a tangled mess, wearing her mother's old Princeton sweatshirt that swallowed her slender frame. "Sorry, sweetheart. I was trying to be quiet." "You're always trying to be quiet," she said, sliding into her chair at the small kitchen table. "But you think too loud." Her observation hit closer to home than she knew. His thoughts had always been his loudest feature, even in the silence of his new life. "Eat your breakfast," he said, placing a plate of scrambled eggs before her. "Quiz today, right?" "Chemistry," she nodded, reaching for the orange juice. "I'm going to ace it." "I know you will." His chest swelled with pride. Emily had inherited her mother's brilliance and his stubbornness, a formidable combination. She was the one bright spot in a life that had dimmed too early. At 5:15, Thomas kissed Emily's forehead and reminded her to lock the door behind her when she left for school. He grabbed his lunch pail, a relic from an America where steel mills still roared, and stepped into the cool morning air. His bicycle, another practical choice after they'd sold the second car, waited faithfully by the steps. In Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a former steel town now struggling to reinvent itself, no one looked twice at an older man cycling to work in pre-dawn darkness. Too many families had their own stories of downward mobility to judge another's. Empire Industries rose like a monument to a more prosperous time. 12 stories of limestone and glass, built in 1946, when American manufacturing seemed invincible. The company had survived while others around it failed, adapting from steel production to advanced materials and defense contracts. Thomas locked his bicycle in the rack reserved for service staff and made his way to the employees' entrance at the back of the building. "Morning, Tom," called to Stanley, the night security guard preparing to end his shift. "Anything exciting happened while I was sleeping?" Thomas offered his practiced smile. "Just the usual dust gathering, Stan. Well, watch yourself today. Big shots from overseas are coming in. Russians, I think. Management's running around like chickens." Thomas nodded, signing the entry log with his employee number rather than his name. "I'll stay out of their way." "Always do, don't you?" Stanley said, not unkindly. "That's why you've lasted longer than most." Thomas clocked in at exactly 5:30 a.m. and made his way to the janitorial closet on the first floor. He changed into his gray uniform, the name Tom, stitched across the pocket, another small erosion of his former identity. Dr. Thomas Miller had published 3 books on Slavic languages. Tom the Janitor cleaned toilets and emptied trash cans. The morning followed its usual pattern: first floor restrooms, lobby dusting, elevator cleaning. By 9:00 a.m., the building had come to life with employees hurrying to their offices, most looking through him as if he were as invisible as the dust he removed. Thomas didn't mind. Invisibility had its advantages. People spoke freely around the janitor, assuming he either couldn't understand or wouldn't care about their conversations. Which is how at 10:43 a.m., while polishing the brass handrails in the executive lobby, Thomas overheard two vice presidents discussing the Russian delegation. "Elizabeth is putting everything on this deal," said the taller one, a man Thomas knew as John from marketing. "$250 million in materials contracts. Board's nervous about dealing with Moscow given the current climate." "Politics is politics, business is business," replied his companion, whose name Thomas couldn't recall. "Besides, they're bringing their own translator. Makes things easier." Thomas kept his head down, his hands moving methodically over the brass, but his mind was translating their words into something more significant. Empire Industries was negotiating a $250 million deal with Russian investors, and they were relying on the other side's translator. In his former life, he would have called this diplomatic malpractice. Now it was just another conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. At noon, Thomas ate his sandwich alone in the maintenance break room, a windowless space in the building's lowest level, far from the executive dining room on the top floor. He read a dog-eared paperback Dostoevsky in the original Russian, one of the few indulgences he still allowed himself from his previous life. "Still reading that foreign stuff?" Tom asked Hector, another janitor who shared his lunch hour. "You some kind of spy or something?" He laughed at his own joke. Thomas smiled politely. "Just like to keep my mind busy." "Well, we got busy coming our way. Big meeting finishing up on 12. They want it cleaned ASAP for another group coming in." Thomas nodded, tucking his book away. "I'll handle 12. The executive floor was a different world. Thick carpets, wood-paneled walls, original artwork. Thomas pushed his cleaning cart quietly down the hallway past offices with actual doors instead of the cubicles below. At the end stood the boardroom, its double doors slightly ajar. He could hear voices inside speaking English, with heavy Russian accents mingled with American responses. Then the sound of chairs pushing back handshakes, formal goodbyes. Thomas stepped aside, pressing his cart against the wall, as men in expensive suits filed out. They looked through him, past him, around him, the perfect invisibility of service work. Last came a woman in her early 50s, sharp-featured and composed, whom Thomas recognized as Elizabeth Whitmore, CEO of Empire Industries. Unlike the others, she acknowledged him with a brief nod before disappearing down the hallway with the visitors. Only when the corridor emptied did Thomas wheel his cart into the boardroom. Coffee cups with lipstick stains and fingerprints, scattered papers, chairs askew. He worked methodically, restoring order to chaos, emptying trash cans filled with crumpled notes and discarded agendas. On the conference table, someone had left a projector running its screen displaying Project Nova Quarterly Implementation Timeline. Thomas moved to shut it down when a folder caught his eye. Thick leather embossed with Cyrillic letters. Inside, dozens of pages of contract terms, mostly in English, but with several attachments in Russian. He should have closed it immediately, should have walked away. But decades of linguistic training made the words leap out at him before he could look away. The Russian attachment contained a clause absent from the English documents, a provision that eliminated all liability protections for Empire Industries in case of product failure or dispute. As written, it would expose the company to unlimited financial responsibility while shielding the Russian partner completely. It was a masterful trap, hidden in plain sight but visible only to someone who could read both languages fluently. Thomas's heart raced. This wasn't just a bad deal, it was potentially ruinous. If signed, Empire Industries could face catastrophic losses. His hands shook slightly as he photographed the pages with his old flip phone, another relic of his diminished circumstances. He carefully returned the folder exactly as he had found it, closed the projector, and finished cleaning the room. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Thomas sat at their small kitchen table, translating the Russian clauses word for word, adding annotations about cultural context and legal implications. His old Georgetown University mug, filled with black coffee, grew cold beside him as he worked well past midnight, the familiar rhythm of translation bringing back memories of late nights in his campus office. When he finished, he sealed the translation in a plain manila envelope with a single line written on the front, "Read before signing." No signature, no name, nothing to identify the floor cleaner who'd momentarily stepped back into his former expertise. The next morning, Thomas arrived at work earlier than usual. The executive floor was empty, security cameras still in night mode. He slid the envelope under Elizabeth Whitmore's office door, then returned to the first floor to begin his regular routine. At 10:17 a.m., Thomas was cleaning the lobby's glass directory when his supervisor's voice crackled over his radio. Tom, report to security main desk, now. Thomas's stomach tightened. Had he been caught on camera? Was this the end of the job he couldn't afford to lose, with Emily's future hanging in the balance? Even this meager position was essential. Stanley was at the security desk looking uncomfortable. Tom, they want you upstairs, 49th floor. The executive offices, Thomas asked, confusion evident in his voice. Why? Stanley shrugged. Above my pay grade, friend. But they said immediately. The elevator ride felt eternal. Thomas removed his cleaning gloves, suddenly conscious of his gray uniform, the cleaning chemicals clinging to the fabric. The doors opened directly into a reception area where a young woman in a tailored suit looked up from her computer. Mr. Miller, she asked, emphasizing his proper name, in a way that made it clear she knew it wasn't just Tom. Yes, he answered, his voice rough from disuse. Miss Whitmore is expecting you. This way, please. She led him down a hallway lined with black and white photographs of the company's history breaking ground in 1946, opening new wings in the 50s, handshakes with presidents in the 60s and 70s. The hallway ended at a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river valley, where Millbrook nestled steel mills now silent along its banks. Elizabeth Whitmore stood as he entered, the manila envelope open on her desk. She was taller than she appeared from a distance, her dark hair streaked with silver eyes sharp with intelligence, and something Thomas couldn't quite identify, curiosity perhaps, or suspicion. Mr. Miller, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Or should I say Dr. Miller? Thomas remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back from long habit when addressing authority. Either is fine, ma'am. Please sit. It wasn't a request. You're the one who left this. She tapped the envelope. Yes. You read confidential documents. I cleaned a room where documents were left open, he corrected gently. I saw what was in plain sight. She studied him, her gaze unwavering. And you speak Russian? Yes, along with Polish, German, Czech, Ukrainian, and passable Mandarin. Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps. According to your employment file, you're a high school graduate from Ohio. Thomas met her gaze evenly. My employment file contains what was necessary to secure a position cleaning floors. Not your doctorate from Cornell or your tenure at Georgetown. Those qualifications seemed excessive for the position available. A smile threatened at the corners of her mouth, but didn't fully materialize. And yet here you are, potentially saving my company from a disastrous contract clause that our entire legal department missed. She picked up the translation. This analysis is expert level, not just language, but legal and cultural context. Thomas said nothing. Years of academic debate had taught him when silence was more effective than words. Elizabeth pressed a button on her desk phone. Janet pulled Dr. Miller's complete background file, the real one, not what's in HR, and called Richard down from legal. She released the button and focused again on Thomas. Why did you do this? Leave this analysis anonymously instead of bringing it to someone's attention directly. Thomas considered his answer carefully. In my experience, people in positions of power rarely welcome unsolicited advice, especially from those they consider beneath them. And yet you took the risk. Some principles transcend hierarchies, Ms. Whitmore. She leaned back in her chair, studying him with new interest. Such as, truth, he said simply, regardless of who speaks it. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door and a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses entered. He carried a tablet and wore the harried expression of someone perpetually behind schedule. You wanted to see me, Elizabeth? He stopped short when he noticed Thomas. Should I come back? Richard, this is Dr. Thomas Miller. He's the one who identified the Russian clause in the Nova contract. Richard blinked rapidly, looking between Thomas and Elizabeth with visible confusion. The janitor. The linguistics professor, Elizabeth corrected, who happens to currently work in our maintenance department. Dr. Miller, this is Richard Harmon, our chief legal counsel. Thomas nodded politely but remained silent. Richard explained to me how our entire legal team missed a clause that would have exposed us to unlimited liability. Richard's face paled. What clause? We had the standard translation, service review, all foreign language documents. Elizabeth handed him Thomas's analysis. This clause, hidden in what was supposedly a technical appendix about material specifications. Richard scanned the pages, his expression growing increasingly alarmed. This isn't in the English version at all. It's completely one-sided. He looked up at Thomas. You found this? Dr. Miller found it, translated it, and analyzed its implications, Elizabeth said. While cleaning the boardroom after your team left confidential documents unsecured, Richard had the good grace to look embarrassed. I'll need to review this with the team immediately. The signing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Cancel it, Elizabeth said firmly. Tell them we found discrepancies that require further review. And Richard, find out who on our side approved these documents without proper translation. After Richard left, Elizabeth turned back to Thomas. Your file makes for interesting reading, Dr. Miller. You were on track for department chair at Georgetown, published, respected in your field. Then suddenly you resign and disappear from academia entirely. Why? Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest whenever he approached this subject. Personal reasons. Your wife's death, she said, softening her tone slightly. I'm sorry for your loss. But that doesn't explain abandoning your career entirely. My daughter needed stability more than I needed professional standing. Admirable, but incomplete. Elizabeth opened a folder on her desk. You reported a senior colleague for academic plagiarism 3 months before your resignation. Professor Alan Westfield caught copying passages from a Polish doctoral dissertation he assumed no one would recognize. The university buried it, quietly removed the student, quietly pushed you out. Thomas's jaw tightened. You've been thorough. I'm considering entrusting you with sensitive information. Thoroughness is essential. She closed the folder. You chose integrity over career advancement once before. It cost you everything professionally. Not everything, Thomas corrected. I kept what matters most. Your principles. My daughter's respect, he said quietly. She knows her father stands by what's right, even when it's difficult. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. Dr. Miller, I find myself in need of someone with your unique combination of skills and moral clarity. Empire Industries conducts business in 27 countries. We have contracts in 16 languages. Until today, I believed our legal team was adequately reviewing all documents. Clearly not, Thomas said. Clearly, she agreed. I'm proposing a special assignment. You would review key international contracts and communications identifying any discrepancies or hidden clauses like the one you found today. Thomas frowned. While continuing as a janitor. While officially continuing as a janitor, she clarified. Your cover, so to speak. But you'd be reassigned to a private office and compensated appropriately for your expertise. Why the secrecy? Elizabeth's expression hardened slightly. Because if someone in my company deliberately hid that clause in the Russian documentation, I want to know who it was before they know I'm looking. Thomas considered her offer. The extra money would help with Emily's college fund, and the intellectual challenge appealed to the part of him that had withered during years of menial labor. But there were practical concerns. My shift starts at 5:30 a.m. I need to be home when my daughter returns from school. We can work around your schedule, Elizabeth assured him. You'll report directly to me. No one else needs to know what you're really doing. And if I find nothing, then I've wasted some money and gained peace of mind. She leaned forward. But something tells me you will find more. The question is whether you want to be part of exposing it. Thomas thought of Emily, of the limited future he could provide on a janitor's salary, of the intellectual desert his life had become, of the principles he'd taught his daughter to uphold. I'll need access to all international contracts from the past 5 years, he said finally, and complete confidentiality regarding my involvement. Elizabeth smiled for the first time, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely handsome to striking. Welcome aboard, Dr. Miller. Officially, you're being reassigned to special maintenance projects requiring security clearance. Unofficially, you're my new linguistics security consultant. She stood and extended her hand. Thomas rose and took it, feeling the firmness of her grip, a businesswoman used to male-dominated boardrooms where handshakes were currency. I'll need a small team, Thomas said. People who can access systems and records without raising suspicion. You have someone in mind. Not yet, but I'll need more than language skills to uncover whatever's happening here. Elizabeth nodded. Choose carefully. Trust no one until I've vetted them personally. She walked to the window, looking out over the town. Empire Industries has been the backbone of Millbrook for 3 generations. My grandfather built it from nothing. My father expanded it internationally. I won't be the Whitmore who loses it through negligence or betrayal. Thomas joined her at the window. From 12 stories up, Millbrook looked almost prosperous, its decline hidden by distance. Church steeples rose above tree-lined streets. The high school football field gleamed green in the morning sun. But he knew the reality at ground level. The closed shops, the foreclosed homes, the quiet desperation of a town whose economic heart had stopped beating decades ago. Why did you really leave academia, Dr. Miller? Elizabeth asked without looking at him. Thomas considered deflecting again, but found himself answering truthfully. Because I thought being right would matter more than being safe. It didn't. She turned to him, her eyes sharp with recognition. And now I just want my daughter to grow up believing that truth still matters in this world. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Then we have more in common than you might think. She returned to her desk and pressed a button. Janet, please show Dr. Miller to the secure office on B3. He'll need a new access card, classification level 4. As Thomas followed the assistant out, Elizabeth called after him. Miller, what would you call this project of ours? Every initiative needs a code name. Thomas thought for a moment, remembering the national symbol that had once stood for vigilance and protection. Eagle Eye, he said, because some things can only be seen clearly from above. The basement level of Empire Industries was a labyrinth of storage rooms, maintenance shops, and forgotten offices from earlier eras. Janet led Thomas through a series of corridors to a heavy metal door marked Archive 3B. She swiped her card, then entered a code on a keypad. This was a secure document room during the Cold War, she explained as the door swung open. It's been unused for years, but the security systems were recently upgraded. The room beyond was surprisingly large, perhaps 30 feet square, with no windows and only the single entrance. Metal shelving lined the walls empty, now except for a few dusty boxes. A desk and chair had been placed in the center, along with a new computer and phone. Ms. Whitmore had this set up this morning as soon as she read your analysis, Janet said. Your new access card will be ready this afternoon. Until then, I'm to stay with you if you need to leave this room. Thomas nodded, taking in what would be his new workspace. I'll need access to the contract database and personnel files for the legal department. Ms. Whitmore anticipated that. You have temporary admin credentials on the computer. She also left this for you. Janet handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Truth is seeing what others overlook. Don't overlook anything. Beneath it was a list of names, 5 employees across different departments, with brief annotations beside each. Robert Chen, IT Security. Brilliant but overlooked. Reported security vulnerabilities that were ignored. Maria Gonzalez, Financial Analysis. Single mother, flagged unusual payment patterns to overseas accounts. Investigation closed without explanation. Franklin Washington, Accounting. 30-plus years with company, old-school record keeper, knows where bodies are buried. Abigail Foster, legal intern. Sharp, asks uncomfortable questions, daughter of my father's oldest friend. Jack Ellison, VP International Business Development. Do not trust. Signed off on Russian contract. Watch closely. Thomas studied the list, understanding its significance. Elizabeth was giving him a starting point, potential allies, and at least one suspected adversary. The chessboard was being set. Please tell Ms. Whitmore I'll begin immediately, he told Janet, and that I'll have a preliminary report by tomorrow morning. After she left, Thomas sat at the desk, feeling the weight of his new responsibility. For 5 years, he had lived a diminished life, trading intellectual challenge for the simple security of a paycheck. Now he was being asked to step back into a world of analysis and investigation, to use the mind he had deliberately set aside when Sarah died. He booted up the computer and entered the credentials Janet had provided. The screen filled with folders labeled by country and year, thousands of contracts, communications, and agreements spanning decades of international business. Where others might have seen an overwhelming task, Thomas saw patterns waiting to be discovered, languages waiting to be decoded. He started with the Russian contract, examining every page in both languages, comparing versions with meticulous attention. The discrepancies went beyond the liability clause. Dates were shifted subtly. Performance metrics were defined differently. Payment terms were more favorable to the Russian side in their version. These weren't translation errors. They were deliberate manipulations crafted by someone who understood both languages well enough to create discrepancies that would only become apparent after the contract was in force. By late afternoon, Thomas had compiled a 12-page analysis documenting every variance between the English and Russian versions. The pattern was clear. Empire Industries was being systematically disadvantaged, with potential losses far exceeding the contract's value. At 3:15, his phone buzzed with a text from Emily. Staying late for science club, home by 5:30. Don't forget pizza night. Thomas smiled, grateful for his daughter's independence, even as he missed their after-school conversations. He texted back, pizza will be waiting, love you. He was about to return to his analysis when there was a knock at the door. Elizabeth entered looking more tired than she had that morning. "I've just spent 3 hours with our Russian partners," she said without preamble. "They're not happy about the delay." "They wouldn't be," Thomas replied, handing her his analysis. "It's worse than we thought." Elizabeth scanned the document, her expression darkening with each page. "This is deliberate, systematic, yes, and sophisticated. Whoever crafted these discrepancies understands both legal and linguistic nuances." Thomas pointed to his computer screen. "I've started examining other international contracts. The pattern repeats, subtle in some cases, blatant in others, but always disadvantaging Empire Industries." Elizabeth sank into a chair across from him. "How long has this been happening?" "I've found examples going back at least 3 years, but I've only scratched the surface." "3 years," she repeated, "since Jack Ellison became VP of International Development. His signature appears on every problematic contract I've examined so far," Thomas confirmed. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "He was my father's protege, handpicked to expand our global presence." "He may have expanded something else entirely," Thomas said carefully. "These contracts have collectively cost Empire Industries millions in unfavorable terms. Someone is benefiting from that loss." "Follow the money," Elizabeth murmured. "That's where we'll find the truth." She stood abruptly. "I need your team assembled by tomorrow. We'll meet here at 700 a.m. Can you adjust your schedule?" Thomas nodded. "Emily has early band practice on Thursdays. I can arrange it." "Good. I'll have the people from my list notified of their special assignment." She paused at the door. "Dr. Miller, what you've discovered today may save more than just money. It might save this company's future and with it this town's." After she left, Thomas continued working until 5:30 modern, then shut down the computer and made his way back to the main floor. He changed out of his uniform in the maintenance locker room, careful to maintain his routine in case anyone was watching. Stanley nodded to him as he left through the service entrance, just another janitor ending his shift. As Thomas unlocked his bicycle, he noticed a black sedan idling nearby, its windows tinted. The car pulled away as he began pedaling home, but he could feel eyes following him through the darkening streets of Millbrook. At home, Emily was already setting the table when he arrived with pizza. Her face lit up at the sight of him, a light that had dimmed during the difficult years after Sarah's death, but had never fully extinguished. "You're smiling," she observed as they sat down to eat. "Like a real smile, not your fake everything is fine smile." "Am I that transparent?" he asked, passing her a slice. "To me, always." She studied him over the rim of her water glass. Something happened at work. Thomas hesitated. His instinct was to protect Emily from complications from worry, but she was perceptive and mature beyond her 13 years. "I may have an opportunity," he said carefully, "to use my old skills again." Emily's eyes widened. "Teaching? Not exactly, more like consulting, special project." "That's why you're actually happy for once," she said, nodding to herself. "Your brain is finally getting used again." Thomas chuckled. "My brain gets used plenty." "Dad, you read Dostoevsky for fun. Cleaning floors isn't exactly stimulating your intellect. It pays the bills." "Barely," Emily said with the brutal honesty of adolescence. "And it makes you sad. I see it every day." Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Nothing that keeps you safe and cared for could ever make me truly sad." Emily rolled her eyes but squeezed back. "So this new thing, is it dangerous?" The question caught him off guard. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you've got that look. The same one you had when you stood up to Professor Westfield." She shrugged at his surprised expression. "Mom told me that story before she died. How you risked everything because it was right." Thomas felt a surge of emotion, grief for Sarah, pride in Emily, and a renewed sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "It's not dangerous," he assured her, not entirely convinced himself. "Just important." "Good," Emily said firmly, "because I need you around, old man, at least until I get to college." Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Thomas sat at their small kitchen table, a single lamp illuminating the yellow legal pad before him. He was making notes, connections between contracts, recurring patterns, names that appeared too frequently. In the quiet of the apartment, with only the distant sound of a freight train passing through Millbrook, Thomas allowed himself to acknowledge what he had suppressed all day: fear. Not just for himself or his job, but fear of being right. Because if he was right, if Empire Industries was being systematically undermined from within, then the implications extended far beyond business contracts. Someone had betrayed not just a company, but an entire community that depended on it. And in Thomas's experience, those who betrayed once rarely stopped at a single transgression. He thought of the black sedan that had followed him home, of Jack Ellison's signature on manipulated contracts, of Elizabeth Whitmore's trust in a janitor she had only just discovered was more than he appeared. On his legal pad, Thomas wrote a single question that would guide his investigation in the days to come. Why now? Why had these manipulated contracts suddenly become visible? Why had he, of all people, been the one to discover them? And most troublingly, what had happened to anyone who might have discovered them before? As midnight approached, Thomas closed his notes and turned out the light. Tomorrow, he would begin assembling a team to find answers. Tomorrow, Eagle Eye would take flight, seeing what others had overlooked or deliberately ignored. But tonight, in the darkness of a modest apartment in a dying steel town, Thomas Miller made a silent promise to his sleeping daughter. Whatever truth he uncovered, whatever cost it demanded, he would not be silenced again. The truth would be heard, and this time he would make sure it mattered. Dawn broke over Millbrook with industrial clarity, the sky painted in steel blues and iron grays. Thomas arrived at Empire Industries earlier than usual, his bicycle cutting through morning mist that hung over the river like secrets waiting to be revealed. The weight of his backpack now filled with notes rather than lunch pressed against his shoulders, a physical reminder of his new purpose. Stanley greeted him with a knowing nod at the service entrance. Special assignment, huh? Must be some fancy cleaning project. Thomas offered a non-committal smile. Just following orders, Stan. Well, you're moving up in the world. Even got your own special access card. Stanley handed him a new ID badge, still with the maintenance department logo, but now with a distinctive blue stripe across the top. Level 4 clearance. That's higher than mine, Tom. Probably a mistake, Thomas said, clipping the badge to his uniform. You know how management is. Stanley's eyes narrowed slightly. Just be careful up there with the suits. They play different games than folks like us. The warning stayed with Thomas as he navigated the empty corridors to Archive 3B. Stanley had been at Empire Industries for nearly 20 years. He knew the rhythms and politics of the place better than most. If he sensed something unusual, it wasn't to be dismissed. The heavy door to Archive 3B opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing that the space had been transformed overnight. The single desk had been replaced with a conference table surrounded by 5 chairs. New computers lined one wall, while another now displayed multiple monitors showing security camera feeds from throughout the building. In the center of the table sat a coffee pot and 5 mugs each bearing the Empire Industries logo. Elizabeth Whitmore stood by the monitors, her back to the door, studying what appeared to be employee photographs. She turned as Thomas entered, her expression guarded but determined. Dr. Miller, right on time. Old habits, he replied, taking in the room's transformation. You've been busy. Preparations matter. She gestured to the table. Your team will be here shortly. Each has been told only that they're part of a special audit project with the highest confidentiality. Nothing about contract discrepancies or potential improprieties. Thomas set his backpack on the table. You don't trust them. I trust them more than most, which is why they're here, sir. But complete transparency is a luxury we can't afford until we know the full scope of what we're dealing with. She handed him a folder. Your official assignment parameters, should anyone ask. Maintenance systems, security review. Boring enough that no one will ask questions. Thomas skimmed the document, a perfectly crafted cover story complete with technical specifications and schedule milestones. Very thorough. I've had practice creating plausible narratives, Elizabeth said with a hint of weariness. Corporate leadership requires certain performances. Before Thomas could respond, the door opened again, and a young Asian man entered, his expression a mixture of confusion and wariness. He wore a rumpled button-down shirt beneath a company ID badge, identifying him as Robert Chen, Information Security. Ms. Whitmore, he said, clearly surprised to find the CEO in a basement archive room. I was told to report here for a special assignment. Mr. Chen, thank you for coming. Elizabeth gestured to Thomas. This is Dr. Thomas Miller. He'll be leading this project. Robert's eyes flicked to Thomas's maintenance uniform, then back to Elizabeth. The janitor, that particular detail is part of what makes this assignment special, Elizabeth replied. Please have a seat. The others will be here momentarily. As if on cue, the door opened again, admitting a middle-aged Latina woman in a conservative pantsuit, followed by an older African-American man with a bow tie and wire-rimmed glasses, and finally a young woman barely out of college clutching a legal pad to her chest like a shield. Maria Franklin Abigail, thank you all for coming, Elizabeth said. Please sit down. What we're about to discuss doesn't leave this room. The group settled around the table exchanging curious glances. Thomas remained standing, feeling the weight of their scrutiny in his maintenance uniform. Elizabeth moved to the door, securing it with the keypad code. Before we begin, she said, turning to face the room, I need each of you to understand something. You've been selected for this team because at some point each of you has demonstrated a commitment to truth over convenience. That quality is rare, and frankly, not always rewarded in corporate America. Franklin Washington, the older man, removed his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief. With all due respect, Ms. Whitmore, why am I here? I'm 3 months from retirement. My truth-telling days are behind me. Elizabeth smiled. Because you've been with this company since my father ran it, Mr. Washington. You know its bones and its ghosts. And me? Asked Maria Gonzalez, her voice carrying a slight accent. I'm just a financial analyst, level 3 clearance at best. You flagged unusual payment patterns to overseas accounts last year, Elizabeth said, an investigation that was mysteriously closed without resolution. Maria's eyes widened slightly. You knew about that? I know more than people think, Elizabeth replied. She gestured to the youngest woman. Abigail Foster, legal intern, daughter of my father's oldest friend, currently questioning why her supervisor asked her to misplace certain documents related to our Asian subsidiaries. Abigail's face flushed. How did you? And Robert Chen, Elizabeth continued, who submitted 3 reports on security vulnerabilities in our contract management system. Reports that vanished into administrative purgatory. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They said it wasn't a priority. It should have been. Elizabeth's voice hardened. And now we know why. She nodded to Thomas, who stepped forward, suddenly conscious of the contrast between his uniform and his role. My name is Dr. Thomas Miller. He began, watching their expressions shift at the unexpected title. Until yesterday, I was known to most of you, if you noticed me at all, as the man who cleaned your offices. Before that, I was a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University, specializing in Slavic and East Asian languages. He opened his backpack and removed several folders, placing one before each person at the table. Yesterday, while cleaning the executive boardroom, I discovered discrepancies in the Russian contract for Project Nova. Discrepancies that would have cost this company millions of dollars and exposed it to unlimited liability. As they opened the folders, Thomas continued, further investigation revealed that this was not an isolated incident. For at least 3 years, Empire Industries has been systematically disadvantaged in its international contracts through deliberate mistranslations and hidden clauses. Franklin was the first to look up from the documents, his expression grave. This is fraud. At minimum, Thomas agreed, possibly worse. Industrial espionage, Robert suggested, scanning the technical specifications in the Russian contract. These materials transfer terms. They're practically giving away proprietary technology. Maria flipped through financial projections with practiced efficiency. These payment schedules create float periods where significant sums would be untraceable for up to 72 hours. She looked up sharply. Exactly like the patterns I flagged last year. Abigail, the youngest, but clearly not intimidated, pointed to specific paragraphs. These aren't just bad terms. They're deliberately crafted to appear standard in English while containing poison pills in the foreign language versions. She glanced at Thomas with new respect. How many languages have you examined? Russian, German, Mandarin, and French so far, he replied, all with similar patterns. Elizabeth, who had been silently observing, now stepped forward. This is why you're here. Project Eagle Eye has one mission: determine who is behind these manipulated contracts, how extensive the damage is, and how high the betrayal goes. Franklin leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. You realize what you're suggesting? Someone inside Empire Industries, likely at executive level, has been deliberately undermining the company's interests for years. Yes, Elizabeth said simply. Why? Abigail asked. What's the motive? That, Thomas said, is our first question to answer. Robert, already typing on his laptop, looked up. Follow the money, always follow the money. Precisely, Elizabeth agreed. which is why this team represents the perfect skill set. Dr. Miller provides linguistic expertise. Robert, you'll trace digital trails. Maria will follow financial flows. Franklin knows the company's history and filing systems. And Abigail brings legal perspective. What about Jack Ellison? Thomas asked quietly. A silence fell over the room. Elizabeth's expression hardened. Jack Ellison is not to know about this investigation. His signature appears on every problematic contract we've identified so far. Franklin whistled softly. Jack's been with the company for 15 years. Your father brought him in personally, which makes his potential betrayal all the more significant, Elizabeth replied. Until we know the full extent of his involvement, he remains under observation but uninformed. She moved to the door. You'll report directly to me through Dr. Miller. No emails, no written reports through normal channels. Everything stays in this room. She paused her hand on the doorknob. Empire Industries has been the economic heart of Millbrook for 3 generations. If it fails, this town dies with it. Remember that when the work gets difficult or dangerous. After she left, a heavy silence fell over the room. The 4 employees looked at Thomas, their expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity. So, Maria said finally, the janitor is actually a linguistics professor leading a corporate espionage investigation. Thomas smiled slightly. Life takes unexpected turns. Why did you leave academia? Abigail asked bluntly. Georgetown to this, she gestured at his uniform. Personal reasons, Thomas said, the familiar deflection coming automatically. Then reconsidering, he added, my wife died 5 years ago. I have a 13-year-old daughter. Academia doesn't accommodate single parents well. I'm sorry for your loss, Maria said quietly. As a single mother herself, her sympathy carried particular weight. Franklin studied Thomas over his glasses. That explains the career change. Doesn't explain why you're cleaning floors instead of teaching high school or translating documents from home. Thomas met the older man's gaze. Let's just say I discovered that institutions prefer comfort over truth. When given the choice between protecting their reputation or doing what's right, they rarely choose the latter. Franklin nodded slowly, a glimmer of understanding passing between them. Ain't that the gospel truth? Robert, who had been quietly typing throughout this exchange, suddenly straightened. I've gained access to the contract management system's audit logs. He turned his laptop so they could see the screen. Look at the access patterns for international contracts. Same user ID accessing files late at night, always after normal business hours. Whose ID? Thomas asked, leaning closer. That's the thing, Robert said, his voice dropping despite the secure room. It's executive assistant pool access credentials. Generic login used by multiple administrative staff. Impossible to trace to a specific person. Not impossible, Franklin corrected. Just requires old-school methods instead of digital ones. He stood straightening his bow tie. Who has access to executive assistant credentials? Who works late regularly? Who has both language skills and legal knowledge? He smiled thinly. People forget that before computers, we kept track of employees the traditional way by watching them. Thomas nodded. Franklin's right. We need human intelligence as much as digital forensics. I can help with that, Abigail offered. As an intern, I'm practically invisible in meetings. People speak freely around me. And I already am invisible, Thomas added with a wry smile. No one notices the man cleaning their office. Then we have our starting points, Thomas said, moving to the whiteboard mounted on the wall. He began writing names, connecting them with lines and question marks. Robert focused on digital trails, access logs, email communications, anything connecting our suspects to these contracts. Maria, follow the money, unusual payments, offshore accounts, unexplained profits. Franklin, you're our institutional memory, look for patterns going back before digital records. Abigail, legal vulnerabilities and document trails. I'll continue linguistic analysis and coordinate our findings. As they dispersed to their assigned tasks, Thomas felt a strange sense of familiar purpose, returning the methodical construction of knowledge from disparate facts, the intellectual challenge he had abandoned years ago. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was fully engaging his mind again. By mid-morning, the small room had transformed into an investigation center. Robert had set up multiple screens displaying data flows and access logs. Maria had spreadsheets of financial transactions pinned to a corkboard. Franklin had disappeared to the physical archives, returning with dust-covered boxes of personnel files and board minutes from decades past. Abigail was constructing a timeline of international contracts color-coded by language and significance. Thomas moved between their stations, connecting dots that others might miss, finding patterns in seemingly unrelated details. His years of linguistic training had honed his ability to see systems within chaos, grammar within noise. At noon, he stepped out to call Emily, maintaining their daily check-in routine. "Hey, Dad," she answered the sounds of the school cafeteria in the background. "Still doing your special project?" "Yes," he said, smiling at her casual acceptance of his changed circumstances. "How was the chemistry quiz?" "Aced it, obviously." Her confidence made his heart swell. "Are you going to be late tonight?" Thomas hesitated. The investigation was accelerating, but his promise to Emily remained his first priority. "Home by 6 as always. Just might bring some work with me." "Actual intellectual work," she teased. "Not floor polishing schedules." "Something like that," he chuckled. "Love you, Em." "Love you too, old man." As he ended the call, Thomas became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to find Jack Ellison, Vice President of International Business Development, and the primary suspect in their investigation, watching him with calculated curiosity. Ellison was in his late 40s, expensively dressed with the confident posture of someone accustomed to power. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached. "You're Miller, right? The maintenance worker Elizabeth has reassigned to some special project?" Thomas straightened, immediately falling into the slightly deferential posture expected of service staff. "Yes, sir. System security review." In the old archives, Ellison's tone was casual, but his gaze was sharp. "Seems an unusual location." "I just go where they tell me, sir." Ellison studied him with the dismissive assessment of a man measuring someone he considered irrelevant. "Of course. Well, don't let me keep you from your duties." As Ellison walked away, Thomas felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Their investigation had already been noticed. The clock was now ticking. When Thomas returned to Archive 3B, he found Franklin waiting with a yellowed folder. "Found something you need to see," the older man said without preamble. "Board minutes from 1972, Project Moon." "The Moon Project," Thomas repeated, a strange echo triggering in his memory. Franklin nodded gravely. "Not the NASA program, code name for a classified defense initiative. Empire Industries was a primary contractor for specialized materials." He opened the folder to reveal meeting minutes with multiple sections redacted in heavy black ink. "These are the only remaining records. Everything else was purged." "What happened?" "Technology transfer," Franklin said, his voice dropping. "Someone inside the company leaked proprietary formulations to foreign interests. Defense Department nearly shut the company down. Only Charles Whitmore's political connections saved Empire Industries." Charles Whitmore, Elizabeth's father. Grandfather, but Franklin corrected. Elizabeth's father was Richard Whitmore. Took over in 1980, expanded internationally. Died in a car accident in 1998. Thomas felt a chill at the mention of a car accident, the same fate that had claimed Sarah. "Was the technology leak ever solved? The perpetrator identified?" Franklin shook his head. "If they were, it never made the official record." But here's what's interesting. After the leak, Empire Industries restructured its entire security protocol, created a special classification system for sensitive documents. He tapped the blue stripe on Thomas's new ID badge. "Level 4 clearance, the same level we're using now." "You think there's a connection to our current situation?" "In my experience," Franklin said, replacing his glasses, "there are no coincidences in corporate America. Only patterns we haven't recognized yet." The afternoon brought more discoveries. Robert identified suspicious network access from terminals that should have been inactive during overnight hours. Maria traced a pattern of micropayments flowing through subsidiaries to numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands. Abigail discovered that certain contract templates had been modified from their original legal department versions before being used internationally. By 4 o'clock, the whiteboard was covered with names, dates, and connecting lines, a constellation of suspicious activities centered around Jack Ellison, but extending to several other executives and mid-level managers. "It's not just one person," Thomas concluded, studying the pattern. "It's a network. A network spanning at least 15 years, Franklin added, possibly longer. Robert looked up from his computer. I've been analyzing email communications between these individuals. They never explicitly discuss anything suspicious, but there are patterns, certain phrases that appear when problematic contracts are being finalized, references to standard protocol and heritage procedures. Code words, Thomas nodded. Classic linguistic misdirection. Say one thing, mean another. But why? Abigail asked the question that had hung over their investigation all day. What's the end game if they're damaging Empire Industries? What do they gain? Maria spread out a financial projection chart. Control through destabilization. These contracts don't just lose money, they specifically weaken the company's position in emerging markets, while strengthening competitive positions for a small group of foreign corporations. She pointed to a list of company names, all with significant ownership ties to the same investment group based in Zurich. Which brings us back to motive, Thomas said, writing "Follow the money" in large letters on the whiteboard. Someone inside is being compensated for undermining Empire Industries' market position. Elizabeth Whitmore returned as they were consolidating their findings. She listened silently as each team member presented their discoveries, her expression growing progressively darker. So it's not just Jack, she said finally. It's systematic, organized. Yes, Thomas confirmed, and deep-rooted. The patterns suggest this has been ongoing for at least a decade, possibly longer. Elizabeth moved to the window, a small reinforced pane that offered the only glimpse of the outside world from their basement sanctuary. My father died when I was 26. Car accident on the interstate. Black ice, they said. I took over with minimal experience in a board that questioned my every decision. She turned back to face them. Now I have to consider whether that accident was truly an accident, whether my father might have discovered what we're uncovering now. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. This was no longer just about contracts and corporate espionage. It was potentially about murder. We need more concrete evidence, Thomas said finally. Right now we have suspicious patterns, but nothing definitively linking any individual to illegal activity. Elizabeth nodded. How do we get that evidence? Robert spoke up. The Nova contract signing has been rescheduled for Monday. If we could access Jack's communications with the Russian team directly, not just what passes through our systems, we might find explicit confirmation. His devices are encrypted, Maria pointed out. Corporate security protocol. Every system has vulnerabilities, Robert countered, especially those operated by humans. Thomas considered the options. We need access to Jack's office, his personal devices, his meeting notes. Impossible during business hours, Franklin said. Too many eyes. Not for me, Thomas replied quietly. I clean executive offices every evening. No one looks twice at the janitor emptying trash cans. Elizabeth frowned. That's incredibly risky. If Jack suspects anything, he already does, Thomas interrupted. He approached me today, asked about our project. The room tensed. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. What did you tell him? System security review, nothing specific, but he's watching. Thomas turned to Robert. What would you need to access his communications? Physical access to his computer for about 10 minutes. Or his phone. Robert thought for a moment. But I could create a mirroring program, install it via USB, would take less than 30 seconds with physical access to his device. Then that's our next step, Thomas decided. I'll access his office tonight during my regular cleaning route. Robert will provide the technical tools. The rest of you continue following your leads. We reconvene tomorrow morning. As the meeting concluded and the team dispersed, Elizabeth asked Thomas to remain behind. When they were alone, she studied him with a mixture of concern and admiration. You've taken to this role with surprising ease, Dr. Miller, from academic to janitor to corporate investigator. Thomas shrugged. Languages are just patterns. So are people. The principles of analysis remain the same. And the principles of self-preservation, she asked pointedly. This isn't an academic exercise anymore. If what we suspect is true, if my father was murdered for discovering this network, then you're placing yourself in significant danger. I'm aware, Thomas said simply. Why take the risk? You have a daughter to consider. The question struck at the heart of his motivation, a complexity he had been avoiding since accepting this assignment. Why indeed for money, for intellectual stimulation, for justice, all true but incomplete? 5 years ago, he said slowly, I witnessed an injustice and spoke up. I was silenced, marginalized, pushed out. I lost my career but kept my integrity. What I didn't keep was my effectiveness. My voice, he met her gaze directly. I want my daughter to see that standing for truth isn't just about personal virtue, it's about making truth matter in the world. Elizabeth nodded understanding, filling her eyes. Even at personal cost. Some principles are worth the price, he said quietly. That evening, Thomas performed his regular cleaning duties, moving methodically through the executive floor as he had hundreds of times before. To anyone observing, he was just Tom the janitor, invisible, unremarkable, beneath notice. When he reached Jack Ellison's office, he closed the door behind him and quickly surveyed the space. The desk was immaculate, laptop closed, and likely secured. But on the credenza behind it sat Ellison's personal tablet, used for notes during meetings and left charging overnight. Thomas removed the small USB device Robert had provided disguised as a common maintenance tool. He connected it to the tablet, watching as the screen briefly flickered, then returned to normal. 28 seconds later, the program was installed, creating a secure backdoor into all of Ellison's communications. As Thomas removed the device, he noticed a framed photograph on the credenza, Jack Ellison shaking hands with an elderly man in what appeared to be Red Square, Moscow in the background. The photo was dated 1998, the year Elizabeth's father died. Thomas used his phone to quickly photograph the image, then continued his cleaning routine. He emptied trash cans, wiped surfaces, and vacuumed carpets with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this work for years. Just another invisible evening in the life of a maintenance worker. As he wheeled his cart toward the service elevator, Thomas noticed light still emanating from one office at the end of the hallway. Richard Montgomery, Chief Strategic Advisor, a 70-year-old company veteran who had served since the 1970s. The door was ajar, and through the gap, Thomas could see Montgomery on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Instinctively, Thomas slowed his cart, listening. Becoming a problem. Yes, Whitmore's daughter. She's asking questions about the old contracts. No, I don't think she knows about Moon yet, but they're digging in the archives. The janitor isn't just a janitor. Former academic linguistics expert. Yes, that could be arranged, but timing is essential. Thomas continued past his heart pounding. He had just overheard confirmation of their worst suspicions and an implicit threat. Montgomery was not just aware of their investigation, he was reporting to someone else, someone outside Empire Industries. By the time Thomas reached his bicycle, his mind was racing with implications. Montgomery had mentioned Moon, the classified defense project from 1972 that Franklin had discovered in the archives. Whatever had happened 50 years ago was somehow connected to the current contract manipulations. The night air felt oppressive as Thomas pedaled home through Millbrook's quiet streets. At one point, he noticed headlights behind him maintaining a consistent distance. When he turned down a side street unnecessarily, the car followed. Only when he reached the busy main avenue did the vehicle finally turn away. Emily was waiting when he arrived home, a pot of spaghetti on the stove and homework spread across the kitchen table. Her smile faltered when she saw his expression. "Dad, what's wrong?" Thomas forced a reassuring smile. "Just a long day, sweetheart. Something smells amazing." She studied him with Sarah's perceptive eyes. "You're doing that thing again, where you try to protect me by not telling me stuff. It's complicated, Em." "I'm 13, not 3, she countered, stirring the pasta sauce with the confidence of someone who had assumed household responsibilities too young. "Mom always said you underestimate how much kids understand." The mention of Sarah and her perpetual insistence on honesty with their daughter struck Thomas deeply. He sat at the kitchen table, suddenly aware of the weight he'd been carrying alone. "You're right," he admitted. "The project I'm working on, it's uncovered some troubling things. People who've been hurting the company for a long time. It might get difficult." Emily considered this as she drained the pasta. Dangerous difficult, or just complicated difficult? "Possibly both," Thomas acknowledged. She nodded, accepting this with surprising equanimity. "Is it the right thing? What you're doing?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "It's definitely the right thing." "And then you have to see it through," she said, simply placing a plate of spaghetti before him. "Mom would say the same thing." Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Emily had grown up too quickly after Sarah's death, developed a maturity beyond her years. Sometimes he forgot how much of both of them lived in her, Sarah's moral clarity and his stubborn persistence. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, managing a genuine smile. "Genetics," she replied with adolescent certainty. "Plus, I had good teachers." Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Thomas sat at the kitchen table reviewing the photograph he'd taken in Ellison's office. There was something familiar about the elderly Russian man with whom Ellison was shaking hands, a face he'd seen before but couldn't place. On impulse, he pulled out the folder Franklin had given him with the 1972 Moon Project documents. Scanning the redacted minutes, he found what he was looking for, a reference to a Soviet delegation that had visited Empire Industries that year, led by a Dr. Mikhail Volkov of the Moscow Institute for Materials Science. Thomas quickly searched online for images of Volkov and found a 1960s photograph that confirmed his suspicion. The elderly man in Ellison's 1998 photo was an aged Volkov, the same Soviet scientist implicated in the 1972 technology transfer scandal. The connection was undeniable. Whatever had begun in 1972 with Project Moon was still ongoing. Jack Ellison hadn't just happened to meet Volkov in Moscow. He was continuing a relationship that stretched back decades. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Program active, data flowing. Found something big. Meeting tomorrow, 6 a.m. As Thomas prepared for bed, he checked the locks on the doors and windows, a precaution he hadn't felt necessary in years. Montgomery's phone conversation had made it clear Thomas and the Eagle Eye team weren't just investigating corporate malfeasance. They were threatening a decades-old operation with powerful interests at stake. The photograph of Ellison and Volkov, the mysterious Project Moon, Montgomery's hushed phone call, the car following him home, pieces of a puzzle far larger and more dangerous than contract discrepancies. In the darkness of his bedroom, Thomas thought of Sarah and the accident that had taken her life. A patch of black ice on a clear night. A single-car accident on a straight stretch of road. Circumstances that had seemed tragic but not suspicious at the time. Now, with Elizabeth's father having died in a similar accident, after potentially discovering the same conspiracy they were now uncovering, Thomas couldn't help but wonder. Had Sarah's death truly been an accident? Or had she somehow, through her work as an investigative journalist, stumbled upon something connected to Empire Industries? The thought sent a chill through him. If there was even a possibility that Sarah's death was connected to what they were discovering now, it transformed his mission from professional obligation to personal reckoning. Sleep came fitfully haunted by memories of Sarah and fears for Emily. Whatever danger he was courting now extended to his daughter as well, the one person he had sworn to protect above all else. Morning arrived with steel-gray determination. Thomas prepared Emily's lunch with extra care, including a note with a simple message. "Be aware today. Call immediately if anything unusual happens. Love, Dad." He kissed her goodbye with a fierce protectiveness that made her roll her eyes, though she hugged him back just as tightly. "Don't worry so much," she told him. "I've got science club after school. Jason's mom is driving me home. I'll text when I'm on my way." Thomas watched her walk to the bus stop, suddenly aware of her vulnerability in a way that made his chest ache. Then he mounted his bicycle and headed toward Empire Industries, where the Eagle Eye team waited with new discoveries and escalating stakes. The basement archive room was already buzzing with activity when Thomas arrived. Robert sat surrounded by computer screens displaying lines of code and communication logs. Maria and Abigail huddled over financial documents. Franklin stood before a large corkboard that now displayed a timeline stretching back to 1970. "Thomas," Robert called, waving him over. "The program worked perfectly. Jack's tablet is completely compromised. I've accessed his email, messaging apps, calendar, everything." "And," Thomas asked, hanging his jacket on the back of a chair. "He's been communicating with someone using an encrypted messaging app. The messages self-destruct, but I captured several before they disappeared." Robert displayed a series of text exchanges on his screen. They're in code, but certain phrases keep recurring. Heritage protocols. Moon phase operations. Continuation structures. Thomas studied the messages. Classic intelligence communication patterns. Double meanings, innocent-sounding phrases that carry operational significance. "There's more," Maria interjected, spreading financial documents across the table. "I've traced the payment patterns. Small amounts routed through multiple shells, ultimately consolidating in an investment fund in Zurich called Lunar Ventures." "Lunar," Thomas repeated. "Moon." Franklin nodded grimly. "It all connects back to Project Moon in 1972. That's where this began." What exactly was Project Moon? Thomas asked. The documents we found were heavily redacted. Franklin hesitated, glancing toward the door as if checking for eavesdroppers. I spoke with an old colleague last night, retired now, but he was in procurement back in the 70s. Project Moon was a classified materials development program for missile defense systems. Empire Industries created a revolutionary heat-resistant compound, something that could withstand temperatures no other material could. And it was stolen, Abigail guessed. Given to the Soviets. Not stolen, Franklin corrected. Sold by someone inside the company. The implication hung in the air like a thundercloud. Thomas moved to the corkboard, studying the timeline Franklin had constructed. 1972, Project Moon technology compromised. 1998, Richard Whitmore dies in car accident after potentially discovering ongoing espionage. Now we find systematic contract manipulation benefiting the same interests connected to the original breach. He turned to face the team. This isn't just corporate espionage. It's a 50-year operation. With Richard Montgomery at its center, Robert added. He's the only executive who spans the entire timeline. Present during Project Moon, served under Richard Whitmore, now advising Elizabeth. Thomas nodded, pulling out his phone to show them the photograph he'd discovered. Jack Ellison meeting with Mikhail Volkov in 1998, the same Soviet scientist implicated in the original technology transfer. The same year Richard Whitmore died. Abigail's eyes widened. You think they killed Elizabeth's father? I think, Thomas said carefully, that people who betray their country once rarely stop there, and people who profit from such betrayal protect their interests at any cost. The door opened, and Elizabeth entered, her expression grave. We have a problem. Jack Ellison has called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. Topic: security breach investigation and unauthorized access to executive systems. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Their operation had been discovered. How? Robert asked. My program was undetectable. Montgomery, Thomas said. I overheard him on the phone last night reporting on our investigation to someone outside the company. He mentioned me, specifically knew my background. Elizabeth's face paled. Richard Montgomery has been my father's trusted advisor since before I was born. He helped me take over when my father died. He can't be the one constant across 5 decades, Franklin finished for her. Ms. Whitmore, I've served this company for 30 years. I've watched Richard Montgomery operate, always in the background, always present at critical junctures, never leaving fingerprints. Elizabeth sank into a chair, the weight of betrayal evident in her posture. If you're right, then my family's company has been compromised since before I was born. My father's death. She couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas moved to the whiteboard, writing rapidly. We need to accelerate. The board meeting gives us a deadline. We need conclusive evidence linking Montgomery Ellison and any other conspirators to both the contract manipulations and the original Project Moon breach. I can get into Montgomery's secure files, Robert offered, now that I know what to look for. I'll compile the financial trails, Maria added. Create an undeniable money map. I need access to the old personnel files, Franklin said. The ones from the 70s, they're in deep storage. Abigail stood. I can get those. As a legal intern, I have authorization to access archived personnel records for compliance review. Thomas nodded. I'll focus on the linguistic analysis of all communications. The coded language they're using might be our key to understanding the full scope of the operation. As the team dispersed to their tasks, Elizabeth remained seated, staring at the photograph of Ellison with Volkov. My father used to say that Empire Industries wasn't just a company, it was America's company, building materials that protected our nation. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes hardening with resolve. If Montgomery and Ellison betrayed that legacy, if they had anything to do with my father's death, I want them destroyed, not just fired, ruined. Justice requires evidence, Thomas reminded her gently. Complete, incontrovertible evidence. Then get it, she said, rising. The board meeting is at 4:00 p.m. I'll delay as long as possible, but by then we need enough proof to end this once and for all. The morning passed in a blur of focused activity. Robert hacked into Montgomery's private server, discovering decades of archived communications with foreign contacts. Maria uncovered an elaborate payment structure, flowing from Russian and Chinese corporations to the Lunar Ventures Fund with Montgomery and Ellison as hidden beneficiaries. Franklin and Abigail returned from deep storage with personnel files showing that key witnesses to the 1972 breach had been systematically removed from the company, fired, transferred, or given early retirement. By noon, a clear picture had emerged. Richard Montgomery had been the original architect of the Project Moon betrayal, recruiting others over decades, including Jack Ellison in the 1990s. The operation had evolved from straight technology transfer to systematic corporate undermining through manipulated contracts, a slower but ultimately more profitable form of industrial espionage. Thomas was analyzing linguistic patterns in Montgomery's communications when a text from Emily made his blood run cold. Someone followed me between classes. Man in suit asking questions about you. Teachers made him leave. I'm okay in principal's office now. His hands shaking, Thomas called Emily immediately. The school principal answered, explaining that an unidentified man claiming to be from family services had attempted to speak with Emily, but fled when confronted by security. The police had been called, and Emily was safe but shaken. I'm coming to get her, Thomas said, already reaching for his jacket. Dr. Miller, the principal replied, using his academic title to Thomas's surprise. The police advised that Emily remain here under their protection until they have investigated. They're concerned this may be related to a custody dispute. There is no custody dispute, Thomas said firmly. Her mother is deceased. I have sole custody. Nevertheless, they believe she's safer here for now. Officers are stationed at the school. Thomas reluctantly agreed, then immediately called Elizabeth. They've targeted Emily, he said without preamble. Someone tried to approach her at school. Elizabeth's response was immediate and decisive. I'm sending our head of security to the school with 2 officers. They'll remain with Emily until this is resolved. Where are you now? Still at Empire. I was about to leave. No, she interrupted. If you leave now, you signal panic. They're trying to distract you, force a mistake. The best way to protect Emily is to finish this today. Thomas knew she was right, but the primal instinct to protect his child warred with logical strategy. If anything happens to her, it won't, Elizabeth assured him. My security team is the best. They're already on their way. Focus on the evidence. End this today. With renewed urgency, the Eagle Eye team consolidated their findings. By 3 o'clock, they had assembled a comprehensive case financial records showing millions funneled to Montgomery and Ellison, communications proving their coordination with foreign interests, contract manipulations systematically undermining Empire Industries while benefiting specific international competitors, and most damning evidence suggesting Richard Montgomery had arranged for accidents to befall those who threatened to expose the operation, including potentially Richard Whitmore. As the board meeting approached, Thomas prepared to present their findings. The evidence would be transmitted to federal authorities. Simultaneously, Elizabeth had arranged for FBI agents to be standing by. At 3:45, Thomas was reviewing his presentation when his phone rang an unknown number. He answered cautiously. Dr. Miller, came a cultured voice he recognized as Richard Montgomery's. I believe we should talk before this afternoon's theatrics begin. Thomas's grip tightened on the phone. I have nothing to say to you. Not even about your daughter Emily, isn't it, bright girl? Has her mother's eyes. Ice flooded Thomas's veins. If you go near her... Please, Montgomery interrupted, his tone almost disappointed. Such melodrama. Emily is perfectly safe at her school, surrounded by Elizabeth's security detail. I have no interest in harming children. Then what do you want? To offer perspective, Dr. Miller. What you've uncovered, what you believe you've uncovered, isn't what you think. Project Moon wasn't betrayal, it was diplomacy. Thomas scoffed. Selling military technology to the Soviets during the Cold War was diplomacy. It was peacemaking, Montgomery insisted. Controlled technology sharing prevented escalation, created balance. You've spent your life studying languages, Dr. Miller. Surely you understand that communication sometimes requires unofficial channels. And the deaths of Richard Whitmore's accident were those diplomacy too, a pause. Regrettable necessities? Richard didn't understand the bigger picture. He saw only betrayal where there was strategic balance. And my wife, Thomas asked the question that had haunted him since connecting the dots. Was Sarah's car accident 5 years ago also a regrettable necessity? Montgomery's silence spoke volumes. She was investigating defense contractor irregularities. Thomas continued, his voice tight with controlled rage. Working on a story about technology transfers to foreign powers. She never mentioned Empire Industries specifically, but she was getting close, wasn't she? I'm truly sorry about your wife, Dr. Miller, Montgomery said finally. These operations span decades. Sometimes, patterns emerge that weren't directly intended. The admission, oblique but unmistakable, hit Thomas like a physical blow. These people had killed Sarah, had orphaned Emily, had destroyed his family in service to their bigger picture. I'm going to destroy you, Thomas said quietly. Everything you've built, every secret you've kept, it all ends today. Consider your daughter, Montgomery replied, his voice hardening. Consider your future. We can offer you positions that would restore everything you lost in academia. Emily could attend any university in the world. Your reputation would be rehabilitated. You're offering a bribe. I'm offering wisdom, Dr. Miller, the same choice generations of patriots have made. Uncomfortable compromise in service to stability. Patriots don't betray their country for profit, Thomas said, and they don't murder innocent people to cover their tracks. Such certainty, Montgomery sighed. The world isn't divided into heroes and villains, Dr. Miller. It's maintained by pragmatists willing to make difficult choices. I've made mine, Thomas replied. See you at the board meeting. He ended the call, his hands shaking with suppressed emotion. The confirmation that Sarah's death was connected to this conspiracy had transformed his mission entirely. This was no longer just about corporate integrity or even national security. It was about justice, personal and profound. At 4:00 p.m., Thomas stood outside the executive boardroom waiting as Elizabeth addressed the board alone. Through the door, he could hear Jack Ellison's voice rising in accusation, demanding an explanation for unauthorized security operations and violations of executive privacy. Then Elizabeth's voice, steady and authoritative. Before we address those concerns, Jack, I believe we should hear from someone with relevant information. Dr. Miller, please join us. Thomas entered the boardroom feeling the weight of 12 pairs of eyes following him. Gone was the janitor's uniform, replaced by a borrowed suit that fit him imperfectly but served its purpose. He was no longer invisible. He was the center of attention in a room where he had previously only emptied trash cans. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, he began his academic training, returning as he addressed the room. My name is Dr. Thomas Miller. Until recently, I was known to most of you, if you noticed me at all, as the man who cleaned your offices. Before that, I was a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University. He moved to the projection screen where his presentation waited. What I'm about to show you is evidence of a conspiracy spanning 5 decades, a systematic betrayal of this company, its shareholders, and the national security of the United States. As Thomas presented the Eagle Eye team's findings, he watched the faces around the table transform from skepticism to shock to outrage. Jack Ellison's complexion paled, then flushed with anger. And at the far end of the table, Richard Montgomery sat perfectly still, his expression betraying nothing as 50 years of careful manipulation unraveled before him. When Thomas concluded, the room fell silent. Then board member Evelyn Drake, a stern woman in her 60s, spoke first. If these allegations are true, this constitutes the most significant corporate espionage case in American history. They're more than allegations, Elizabeth responded, rising to stand beside Thomas. Federal authorities have already received this evidence. They're waiting outside this building now. Jack Ellison surged to his feet. This is absurd, a janitor with a grudge and some manipulated documents. The janitor, Thomas interrupted calmly, has a doctorate in linguistics specialized in Slavic languages and identified discrepancies in international contracts that your legal team conveniently overlooked. The janitor also lost his wife to what you people call a regrettable necessity. Ellison faltered, glancing toward Montgomery, who remained impassive. I've served this company for 47 years, Montgomery said finally, his voice steady. Through Cold War and detente, through booms and recessions. What you've presented as conspiracy, Dr. Meatbone, is simply the necessary compromise of global business. Is murder necessary compromise? Thomas asked quietly. Is Richard Whitmore's accident business as usual? A murmur ran through the board members. Montgomery's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his composure. You have no evidence connecting me to any such event. Actually, Thomas replied, nodding to Elizabeth, we do. Elizabeth activated a recording device. Montgomery's voice filled the room. I'm truly sorry about your wife, Dr. Miller. These operations span decades. Sometimes, patterns emerge that weren't directly intended. The color drained from Montgomery's face as his earlier phone conversation with Thomas played for the entire board. When it concluded, he stood slowly straightening his tie with dignity. You understand nothing of the world in which we operate, he said, addressing not just Thomas, but the entire room. The stability of nations rests on controlled information flow. What you call espionage history will recognize as diplomacy. Save it for your trial, Elizabeth replied coldly. Security is waiting outside to escort you and Mr. Ellison to the federal agents in the lobby. As Montgomery and Ellison were led away, the boardroom erupted in urgent questions and demands for action. Elizabeth handled them with the commanding presence of someone who had finally claimed her full authority. Thomas slipped out quietly, his part in the drama concluded. In the hallway, he called Emily, reassured by her voice and the confirmation that she remained safe at school under police protection. Then he made his way to Archive 3B, where the Eagle Eye team waited anxiously for news. It's done, he told them as he entered. Montgomery and Ellison are in federal custody. The board is in emergency session. The room exhaled, collectively relief, exhaustion, and vindication mingling in the basement air. What happens now? Abigail asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Thomas looked around at these unlikely allies, the IT specialist, the financial analyst, the veteran accountant, the legal intern, and himself, the janitor professor. Together, they had uncovered a conspiracy that spanned generations and crossed international boundaries. Now, he said, we rebuild what they tried to destroy. Later that evening, as Thomas bicycled home through the streets of Millbrook, he felt a strange lightness despite the day's intensity. The town around him, struggling, faded but persisting, seemed somehow more vibrant in the golden light of early evening. Empire Industries would survive, transformed by the truth, but ultimately strengthened by it. Elizabeth Whitmore would lead that transformation with the Eagle Eye team, continuing their work to restore integrity to the company her grandfather had founded. And Thomas Miller, janitor, professor, father, widower, had finally found justice for Sarah and security for Emily. The future remained uncertain, but it would be built on truth rather than compromise. As he turned onto his street, Thomas saw Emily waiting on their apartment steps, her face lighting up at the sight of him. He braked to a stop and she ran to meet him, throwing her arms around him with the fierce protectiveness that had always flowed both ways between them. Dad, the principal said there were FBI agents at Empire Industries. Is everything okay? Are you in trouble? Thomas hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. No trouble, Em. Just the truth finally getting its hearing. She pulled back, studying his face with Sarah's perceptive eyes. Did it have something to do with Mom? The police officer said something about related cases. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. It might have. We'll know more soon. But what matters is that the people responsible are being held accountable now. Emily absorbed this with the quiet dignity that sometimes made her seem far older than 13. Good, she said simply. Then with the resilience of youth, she brightened. I made dinner, mac and cheese from scratch, and I got an A on my chemistry quiz. Thomas smiled, his heart full despite the day's shadows. That's my girl. Let's go celebrate. As they walked up the steps together, Thomas glanced back at Millbrook, spreading below them the town Sarah had loved, the town where Emily was growing up, the town that Empire Industries had built and might yet revitalize. Some truths came at great cost, but living without truth exacted an even greater one. Thomas had learned that lesson twice now, first in academia, then in the corporate world. The price had been high, but the reward was walking beside him, chattering about chemistry and mac and cheese. For that, no price was too steep. The morning sky over Millbrook bloomed with industrial clarity, steel blue and resolute, as Thomas Miller adjusted his tie, a gesture that felt foreign after years in maintenance uniforms. His reflection in the bathroom mirror revealed a man transformed not just by the borrowed suit Elizabeth had insisted he keep, but by purpose rediscovered. 3 weeks had passed since Montgomery and Ellison had been led away in handcuffs. 3 weeks of federal investigations, depositions, and profound institutional change at Empire Industries. Dad, Emily called from the kitchen, your fancy coffee's getting cold. Thomas smiled at his daughter's teasing. The fancy coffee was simply their usual brew, but served in a new mug Emily had bought him, dark blue with Dr. Miller, printed in gold letters. Her small way of celebrating his reclaimed identity. "Coming," he replied, giving his tie one final adjustment. The face that looked back at him seemed years younger than it had a month ago, the heaviness of unresolved grief partially lifted by the knowledge that Sarah's death had not been the random tragedy he'd believed, but connected to the conspiracy they'd uncovered. There was pain in that knowledge, but also a strange peace. In the kitchen, Emily had laid out breakfast with meticulous care, scrambled eggs, toast, and sliced fruit arranged with artistic precision. At 13, she took pride in these domestic accomplishments, skills acquired too young when her mother died and her father retreated into grief. "You're going to be late for your big meeting," she said, checking the clock on the microwave. "Very unprofessional, Dr. Miller." And Thomas chuckled, taking a seat at their small table. "The meeting's not until 9. I have plenty of time." "Still weird that you're going to the executive floor instead of the maintenance department," Emily remarked, joining him at the table. "Good weird, though." "Very weird," Thomas agreed. "I keep expecting someone to tell me I'm in the wrong place." The truth was that Thomas still felt caught between worlds, no longer the invisible janitor, not quite restored to his former academic standing. Elizabeth had created a new position for him at Empire Industries, Director of Linguistic Security and Compliance. His office, once the secure archive room in the basement, had been relocated to the 8th floor, halfway between the executive suites and the operational departments. A middle ground like his life itself. After breakfast, Thomas walked Emily to her bus stop as he did every morning. This ritual had remained unchanged despite the upheaval of recent weeks. Some constants were sacred. "Dad," Emily said as they reached the corner where other students waited, "are you going to testify at the trial when Montgomery and those others go to court?" Thomas nodded, his expression turning serious. "Yes, the prosecutors say I'll be a key witness." Emily considered this, chewing her bottom lip in a gesture so like Sarah that it made his chest ache. "Will they ask about Mom, about her accident?" "They might," he acknowledged. The federal investigation had expanded to include several suspicious deaths potentially connected to Montgomery's network, including Sarah's. "The evidence is circumstantial, but they're looking into it." "Good," Emily said with sudden fierceness. "I want everyone to know what they did. I want it on record." Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, struck by her intensity. "It will be Em, I promise." As her bus arrived, Emily gave him a quick hug, then joined the line of students boarding. She turned back at the last moment. "Make good choices, Dr. Miller," she called, with a grin, co-opting his usual parental send-off. "You too, Ms. Miller," he replied, matching her formality with a smile. Thomas watched the bus pull away, then began his walk to Empire Industries. He had sold his car after Sarah's death, a practical financial decision at the time. Elizabeth had offered a company car as part of his new position, but Thomas had declined. The morning walk gave him time to think, to prepare for days that now engaged his mind in ways his janitorial work never had. Empire Industries loomed ahead, its limestone facade catching the morning light. Thomas remembered his first day as a maintenance worker 5 years ago, how small he had felt approaching those imposing doors. Now he entered through the main entrance, nodding to security guards who knew him by name rather than employee number. "Morning, Dr. Miller," called Stanley, who had been transferred from night security to day shift. "Big day today, I hear." "Morning, Stan. Just meeting same as always." Stanley chuckled. "Not the same as always. Board's voting on the restructuring plan, aren't they? Heard the Eagle Eye team's getting officially recognized." News traveled fast in a company still recovering from institutional betrayal. The Eagle Eye team, originally a covert operation, had become a symbol of integrity within Empire Industries. Elizabeth had proposed making it a permanent division focused on ensuring ethical compliance across all operations. "We'll see what happens," Thomas replied noncommittally, though he knew the proposal would pass. Elizabeth had secured the support of key board members, many of whom were still reeling from the revelation that their company had been compromised for decades. In the elevator, Thomas pressed the button for the 8th floor. As the doors began to close, a hand shot through the gap, and Franklin Washington stepped in, immaculate as always in his bow tie and wire-rimmed glasses. "Dr. Miller," the older man nodded, ready for the Inquisition. Thomas smiled. "Is that what we're calling board meetings now?" When they last 3 hours and involve questioning every decision the company has made since the moon landing. Yes, Franklin adjusted his glasses. But today should be different, Anne. Elizabeth has them eating out of her hand after the quarterly projections showed recovery, despite the scandal. Any pushback on the Eagle Eye proposal? Franklin shook his head. None worth mentioning. Evelyn Drake is fully on board, which means the old guard won't resist. And the younger board members see it as progressive corporate governance, something they can brag about at their country clubs. The elevator stopped at the 8th floor, and both men exited. The hallway before them was newly renovated glass-walled offices, lining both sides with an open workspace in the center where Robert Chen and Maria Gonzalez were already at their stations. Abigail Foster, recently promoted from intern to junior counsel, waved from a conference room where she was arranging documents. Home sweet home, Franklin remarked. Still can't believe we traded a basement dungeon for this prime real estate. Elizabeth understands symbolism, Thomas replied. She wants Eagle Eye visible, not hidden. They made their way to the conference room where the team was gathering for their pre-board meeting preparation. Maria had prepared financial impact assessments. Robert had security protocol recommendations. Abigail had drafted compliance guidelines. Franklin brought historical context. And Thomas would present the overall vision for Eagle Eye's future, a system ensuring that Empire Industries would never again be compromised from within. As they reviewed their materials, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on how their unlikely alliance had evolved. From suspicious strangers in a basement archive to a cohesive team with complementary strengths. They had faced federal interrogations together, weathered media scrutiny, and emerged as the architects of corporate redemption. Before we head upstairs, Thomas said as they concluded their review, I want to thank each of you. What we did, what we're continuing to do matters beyond corporate profits or even national security. We're establishing that truth can prevail even when powerful interests oppose it. Franklin removed his glasses, polishing them with his handkerchief, as he always did when emotion threatened his composure. 30 years I worked here watching things I couldn't quite explain, patterns that didn't make sense. Thought I'd retire with those questions unanswered. Instead, I'm helping rebuild the company I always believed in. He replaced his glasses. Not a bad final chapter. Speaking of unanswered questions, Robert interjected, I found something while securing Montgomery's archived files. He slid a folder across the table to Thomas. Personal correspondence from the 1970s. Nothing directly incriminating, but there are references to a secure storage facility outside company property, referred to only as the silo. Thomas opened the folder, scanning the letters, most handwritten, some typed on now obsolete IBM Selectrics. Any idea where this facility might be? Robert shook his head. Nothing specific, but Montgomery kept these letters separate from company records. Must have been important. The feds have been through Montgomery's office, his home, his records, Maria pointed out. If there was another location, wouldn't they have found it? Not necessarily, Franklin said thoughtfully. Richard Montgomery was old school, pre-digital. He understood that some secrets are best kept on paper in places that don't appear on any official record. Thomas made a mental note to review the letters more carefully later. If Montgomery had maintained a separate facility for sensitive materials, it might contain evidence that even the federal investigation had missed. Their speculation was interrupted by Elizabeth Whitmore's arrival. Dressed in a charcoal suit that projected authority without ostentation, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had weathered a corporate earthquake and emerged stronger. Good morning, Eagle Eye, she greeted them. The board is assembling. We present in 20 minutes. As they gathered their materials, Elizabeth touched Thomas's arm, holding him back as the others filed out. A moment, Dr. Miller. When they were alone, her professional demeanor softened slightly. I received a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning. They've found additional evidence connecting Montgomery to your wife's accident. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. What kind of evidence? Phone records placing one of Montgomery's associates near the accident site that night, and financial transfers to a private investigator who had been tracking Sarah's movements in the weeks prior. Elizabeth watched his reaction carefully. They believe they can prove it wasn't an accident, Thomas. He absorbed this confirmation of what he had already suspected, emotions washing through him in complicated waves. Grief renewed by certainty, anger no longer directionless, And beneath both a terrible validation Sarah hadn't died by random chance. Her death had meaning connected to the truth she had been pursuing. "Thank you for telling me," he managed finally. "They'll want you to testify about her work as a journalist, the stories she was investigating." Elizabeth hesitated. "Will you be all right with that, discussing Sarah in court?" Thomas thought of Emily's fierce declaration that morning. "I want everyone to know what they did. I want it on record." "Yes," he said. "Sarah deserves to have her story told. The whole truth needs to come out." Elizabeth nodded, understanding in her eyes. "One more thing. The board is prepared to offer you a permanent executive position, Vice President of Global Compliance and Ethics. You'd report directly to me with Eagle Eye as your division." The offer caught Thomas off guard. He had expected Eagle Eye to continue, but not his elevation to the executive ranks. "I'm not a corporate person, Elizabeth. I'm an academic who's been cleaning floors for 5 years. "You're exactly what this company needs," she countered. "Someone who sees patterns others miss. Someone who values truth over convenience. Someone who's experienced both the top and bottom of the hierarchy and understands both perspectives." She smiled slightly. "Besides, the Janitor to executive story plays well in the press, shows Empire Industries is serious about transformation." Thomas couldn't help but chuckle at her pragmatism. "I'll consider it, but my priority remains Emily. Any position I accept has to accommodate my responsibilities as a father." "Of course. Flexible hours, work from home options when needed." Elizabeth glanced at her watch. "We should join the others. Board doesn't like to be kept waiting, even by the CEO." The board meeting proceeded largely as Franklin had predicted. The Eagle Eye proposal was approved unanimously, with Evelyn Drake, once a skeptic, becoming its most vocal advocate. The team's presentation was received with thoughtful questions and expressions of support. By noon, Empire Industries had officially established its first dedicated Ethics and Compliance Division, with the Eagle Eye team as its founding members. As the meeting concluded, Thomas found himself engaged in conversation with several board members who had previously looked through him as if he were invisible. Now they sought his insights, valued his perspective. The transformation was surreal, but affirming proof that substance could eventually overcome superficial status markers. Later that afternoon, Thomas returned to his new office to find Robert waiting, his expression suggesting new developments. "I've been analyzing those letters from Montgomery's archive," Robert said without preamble, "cross-referenced with county property records. I think I've located the silo." He spread a map across Thomas's desk, pointing to a rural area 15 miles outside Millbrook. "Property purchased in 1968 by a company called Lunar Agricultural Holdings, the same lunar prefix Montgomery used for his offshore accounts." "What's there now?" Thomas asked, studying the location. "According to satellite imagery, not much. Old farm buildings, a grain silo." Robert pulled up digital photographs on his tablet, but utility records show consistent electrical usage for 50 years. Someone's been maintaining power to an apparently abandoned property. Thomas considered the implications. "Have you told the FBI?" Robert shook his head. "Not yet. Thought you should see it first, given the potential connection to your wife's research. If there are records there that might explain what she discovered." The unspoken suggestion hung between them. This could be where Montgomery stored his most sensitive materials, perhaps including evidence about Sarah's death that even the federal investigation hadn't uncovered. "We should inform Elizabeth," Thomas said, though uncertainty clouded his judgment. Part of him wanted to drive to the property immediately to search for answers without bureaucratic delays. "Already did," Robert replied. "She suggested a preliminary assessment before involving federal authorities. If it's nothing, we avoid wasting their time. If it's significant—" He left the sentence unfinished. Thomas checked his watch. "Emily has band practice until 5:30. That gives us a few hours." He reached for his jacket. "Let's take a look." They took Robert's car, a practical sedan, with none of the flash one might expect from a young IT specialist. As they drove through Millbrook and into the surrounding countryside, Thomas watched the industrial landscape give way to rolling farmland, once prosperous agricultural operations, now struggling in the shadow of corporate farming. "My grandfather worked land like this," Thomas remarked as they passed abandoned barns and fallow fields. "Before the steel mills offered better wages. The family farm couldn't compete." Robert nodded, navigating a narrow county road. My parents came from rural China to Silicon Valley. Same story, different setting. Small operations squeezed out by industrial scale. The property they sought appeared after a final turn onto a gravel road, a weathered farmhouse, several outbuildings in various states of disrepair, and most prominently a cylindrical grain silo rising against the afternoon sky. No vehicles were visible, no signs of recent activity. Yet something about the scene struck Thomas as oddly preserved rather than abandoned. Doesn't look like much, Robert observed as they parked behind a stand of trees obscuring their presence from the main road. That would be the point, Thomas replied, surveying the property with growing certainty. Perfect hiding place, rural, isolated, unremarkable. They approached cautiously alert for security systems or surveillance cameras. The farmhouse was locked, its windows covered with heavy drapes that prevented any view of the interior. The outbuildings, a barn, a shed, a small garage, were similarly secured. The silo stood apart, its concrete form weathered by decades of Pennsylvania seasons. A metal door at its base was secured with a padlock that looked substantially newer than the structure itself. Modern security on an abandoned silo, Robert noted. Interesting choice. Thomas examined the padlock. Not just modern, high security, 8-pin tumbler design. This isn't farm security. Robert pulled out his phone, checking signal strength. I could call a friend who knows about locks, but it would take hours for him to get here. Thomas shook his head, reaching into his pocket for the small case of tools he'd carried as a maintenance worker, a habit he hadn't abandoned despite his changed status. One advantage of janitorial work, you learn to access secured areas when keys go missing. With practiced precision, Thomas selected 2 slender tools and began working on the padlock. Robert watched with raised eyebrows. Georgetown didn't teach lockpicking in their linguistics program, did they? Thomas smiled slightly. Let's call it a practical application of pattern recognition. After several minutes of careful manipulation, the lock clicked open. Pattern successfully recognized. The door swung inward, revealing not the expected hollow storage space, but a metal staircase spiraling downward. Cool air flowed from below, carrying the scent of concrete and paper, an archive's distinctive atmosphere. Underground facility, Robert whispered, awe in his voice. The silo is just the entrance. Thomas nodded, memories stirring from his academic research. Cold War design. Rural Pennsylvania had dozens of repurposed missile silos and bunkers. Most were decommissioned in the 1990s. They descended cautiously, the staircase leading to a reinforced door with a keypad access system. Unlike the padlock above this, presented a more sophisticated OS challenge. Robert examined the keypad without touching it. 6-digit code. No visible wear patterns on the keys to suggest which are used most frequently. Thomas studied the device, noting its age. Late 1990s model, not networked. He thought of Montgomery's correspondence, the repeated references to moon phases as code words. On impulse, he entered 071969, July 1969, the first moon landing. The keypad remained stubbornly red. Wait, Thomas said, a connection forming. Not the Apollo landing. Project Moon, 1972. He entered A031972. The light turned green. The door released with a pneumatic hiss. Beyond lay a climate-controlled room approximately 40 feet in diameter with concentric circles of filing cabinets and shelving units. The walls were lined with flat storage drawers containing what appeared to be technical schematics and blueprints. In the center stood a wooden desk with an old-fashioned Rolodex and a vintage IBM typewriter. Montgomery's private archive. Thomas breathed, taking in the meticulous organization. Each cabinet was labeled by year and subject category: Moon, Apollo, Soyuz, Heritage, Continuity. Robert whistled softly. This is comprehensive, decades of documentation. They moved through the room with growing amazement. The archive contained not just Empire Industries documents, but what appeared to be classified government materials, diplomatic cables, and personal correspondence with Soviet officials dating back to the 1960s. This isn't just about industrial espionage, Thomas said, examining a file labeled Detente Protocols 1971. Montgomery was running a parallel foreign policy operation, using Empire Industries as cover for unofficial diplomatic channels. Look at this, Robert called from across the room. He had opened a cabinet labeled Surveillance, containing dozens of folders organized by name. Personnel files, but not official ones. Thomas joined him, scanning the labels. Many names he didn't recognize, but some leapt out immediately. Whitmore Richard, Chen David, Robert's father, who had once worked for a Defense Department contractor, and most chillingly, Miller Sarah. With trembling hands, Thomas pulled the folder bearing his wife's name. Inside were surveillance photographs, activity reports, and transcripts of phone conversations, a comprehensive documentation of Sarah's movements in the months before her death. The final entry, dated the day of her accident, contained a single typewritten line: subject neutralized, situation contained. Thomas's vision blurred, rage and grief colliding as the clinical confirmation of murder stared back at him from the page. Robert placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Thomas, there's more. Look at the pattern of surveillance. It didn't start with Sarah's investigation. It began earlier with her coverage of defense industry consolidation. Almost like they were watching her before she even knew what story she was uncovering. Thomas forced himself to examine the timeline, objectively, professional training overriding personal anguish. Robert was right. The surveillance had begun nearly a year before Sarah started investigating technology transfers. The first entry referenced subject's connection to linguistics specialists with Slavic language expertise. They weren't monitoring her because of her reporting, Thomas realized with sickening clarity. They were watching her because of me, because of my language skills. He looked up at Robert. I was the threat they were tracking. Sarah became collateral damage when she started investigating independently. The weight of this revelation staggered him. Sarah's death, which he had finally accepted was not random, was now revealed to be even more tragically connected to him than he had imagined. Not just his wife, but targeted because she was his wife. Thomas, Robert said urgently, we need to document everything and contact the authorities. This is evidence of multiple federal crimes: espionage, conspiracy, murder. Thomas nodded mechanically, his mind struggling to process the implications while maintaining professional focus. Start photographing everything. I'll continue searching for additional files. As Robert began systematically documenting the archive's contents, Thomas forced himself to set aside Sarah's file and continue their investigation. In a cabinet marked contingency, he discovered folders outlining emergency protocols, including plans for destroying evidence, evacuating key personnel, and most disturbing, a list of priority containment targets with familiar names: Elizabeth Whitmore, the Eagle Eye team members, and at the top, Miller T. Independent. Emily. They had contingency plans for his daughter. Cold fury replaced shock. Thomas photographed the documents with his phone, then continued searching until he found what he had unconsciously been seeking since entering the facility: a cabinet labeled Heritage Next Generation. Inside were files on younger employees and associates being groomed to continue Montgomery's operation after the original conspirators retired or died. Most names Thomas didn't recognize, but one made him freeze: Foster Abigail, the youngest member of Eagle Eye, daughter of Elizabeth's father's oldest friend, their legal expert who had helped uncover the conspiracy. Thomas opened the file with growing dread. Inside were recruitment assessments, psychological profiles, and meeting notes documenting Abigail's gradual indoctrination into Montgomery's network. The most recent entry, dated just 2 weeks before Montgomery's arrest, indicated she had been activated as an information source within Eagle Eye. Robert, Thomas called, his voice tight. We have a problem. He showed Robert the file, watching comprehension dawn on the younger man's face. Abigail is compromised. She's been reporting to Montgomery's network. But she helped expose them, Robert objected. She provided key evidence. Controlled exposure, Thomas corrected grimly. They sacrificed Montgomery and Ellison to protect the wider network. Look at these organizational charts. They're 3 layers deep. Montgomery was just the visible face. Robert studied the documents, his expression darkening. If Abigail's compromised, then everything we've done since forming Eagle Eye has been monitored, Thomas finished. Our investigation, our evidence, our plans, they've known it all. The implications cascaded through Thomas's mind. The federal investigation focusing narrowly on Montgomery and Ellison, while potentially missing broader connections. The board's surprisingly easy acceptance of Eagle Eye. The offer of an executive position that would integrate Thomas fully into Empire Industries' power structure. We need to leave, Thomas said suddenly. Now, contact Elizabeth directly, not through office channels, and get the FBI here immediately. As they hurriedly completed their documentation and prepared to depart, Thomas's phone vibrated with a text message from Emily. Band practice ended early. Getting a ride home with Jason's mom. Be there in 20-30 minutes. Thomas checked the time. They'd been in the archive longer than he'd realized. I need to get home. Emily will be there soon. I'll stay and secure the site until authorities arrive, Robert offered. You go. Thomas hesitated, torn between professional responsibility and parental protection. If Abigail is compromised, who else might be? We can't trust anyone until we know the full extent of the network. I'll be careful, Robert promised, but this evidence needs protection and your daughter needs you more. Thomas nodded, decision made. Call Elizabeth from outside the property. Use the code phrase we established, archive assessment complete. She'll understand, and contact the federal task force directly. They ascended the spiral staircase, emerging into late afternoon sunshine that seemed incongruously bright, given what they had discovered below. Thomas took Robert's car keys. I'll send someone to pick you up, he said as they parted. Stay out of sight until they arrive. The drive back to Millbrook passed in a blur of urgent calculations. If Montgomery's network remained active despite his arrest, if they had been monitoring Eagle Eye through Abigail, if they knew Thomas had discovered their contingency plans, Emily could be in immediate danger. He tried calling her cell phone repeatedly, each unanswered ring increasing his anxiety. The most likely explanation was innocuous. She was simply in the car with Jason's mother, phone in her backpack. But Thomas could no longer afford optimistic assumptions. As he approached their apartment building, Thomas saw a black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street, similar to vehicles used by federal agents but lacking government plates. His instincts flared. He drove past without slowing, circling the block to approach from another direction while calling Elizabeth. Thomas, I just received Robert's message. Is your security team at my apartment? He interrupted. No, why? There's an unidentified vehicle watching my building. Emily's on her way home. His voice remained controlled despite the fear coursing through him. I need immediate assistance. Elizabeth's response was immediate and decisive. I'm dispatching our head of security and alerting the FBI. Where are you now? 1 block away, approaching from the east. Emily should be arriving any minute. Stay back, Thomas. Wait for backup. But as he turned the final corner, Thomas saw a second black SUV pull up in front of his building. A woman he recognized as Jason's mother emerged with Emily, but 2 men in dark suits quickly approached them. Even from a distance, Thomas could see Emily's body language shift from relaxed to alarmed. Without hesitation, Thomas accelerated toward them, honking repeatedly to create a distraction. The men turned, reaching inside their jackets in a motion Thomas recognized from countless movies, but had never expected to witness in reality. He swerved to block their access to Emily, throwing open the passenger door. Emily, get in now. To her credit, Emily reacted instantly, breaking away from the confused woman and diving into the car. Thomas accelerated before she had even closed the door of the SUV behind them, immediately giving chase. Dad, what's happening? Emily's voice was high with fear as she struggled with her seatbelt. Montgomery's network is still active, Thomas explained, navigating through traffic with reckless precision. They know we found their archive. They're trying to use you to get to me. Emily's eyes widened, but to Thomas's amazement, she didn't panic. Instead, she pulled out her phone. I'm calling 911. No, Thomas countered. We don't know who's compromised. Call this number instead. He recited Elizabeth's direct line from memory. Tell her we're heading east on Maple, being pursued by a black suburban Pennsylvania plate beginning with KLM. As Emily made the call, Thomas focused on evasion, using his knowledge of Millbrook's streets to gain distance from their pursuers. The SUV behind them was faster but limited by the same traffic constraints. Thomas weaved through side streets, doubled back through alleys, and finally turned into the delivery entrance of Millbrook Memorial Hospital, a complex with multiple exits in continuous security presence. Elizabeth says police are converging on this area, Emily reported, ending the call, and FBI agents are securing our apartment and the archive site. Thomas parked behind the hospital's service wing in a loading dock area partially hidden from the street. We'll wait here until Elizabeth confirms it's safe. For a moment, they sat in silence, adrenaline ebbing into shaky aftermath. Then Emily asked in a small voice, This is about Mom, isn't it? What you found at that archive? Thomas turned to his daughter, seeing both fear and determination in her expression. She deserved the truth, however painful. Yes, we found proof that Mom's accident was deliberate. part of Montgomery's operation. Emily absorbed this, her young face processing grief and anger beyond her years. Because she was investigating them. Partly, Thomas admitted, but also because of me, because of my language skills. They were watching her to monitor me. He expected tears accusations. The natural response of a child learning her mother's death was connected to her father's past. Instead, Emily reached across the center console and took his hand. It's not your fault, Dad. Mom was investigating because that's who she was. You were teaching languages because that's who you are. They're the ones who turn that into something dangerous. The simple wisdom of her statement hit Tommy with unexpected force. For weeks, he had carried the burden of causality, the knowledge that Sarah might still be alive, if not for her connection to him. Emily's perspective offered an alternative. They had each been pursuing their natural talents and passions. The criminality lay entirely with those who had weaponized those pursuits. When did you get so wise? He asked, echoing a question he had posed many times during her childhood. Genetics, she replied with the hint of a smile. Plus, I had good teachers. Thomas's phone rang, Elizabeth calling with updates. The police had intercepted the SUV pursuing them. FBI agents had secured the farm property and were cataloging the archive's contents. Most significantly, Abigail Foster had been taken into custody after attempting to access the Eagle Eye secure server with unauthorized credentials. It's safe to come to Empire Industries, Elizabeth concluded. We've established a secure perimeter and federal protection details are being assigned to all Eagle Eye members and their families. We're on our way, Thomas replied. As they drove toward Empire Industries, Emily stared out the window at the town, passing by the familiar streets, now cast in the shadow of conspiracy and danger. Will we have to move? She asked suddenly. Start over somewhere else? Thomas considered the question seriously. The practical answer might be yes. New identities, new location, new lives constructed under federal protection. But something in him rebelled against that solution. Running would mean Montgomery's network had succeeded in disrupting their lives, even from behind bars. No, he said, finally. This is our home. We're not going to be driven away by fear. Emily nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. Good. I have a science competition next month. Her resilience humbled him. Despite the danger, despite the revelations about her mother's death, Emily's focus remained on the future, on science competitions and normal teenage milestones. Not because she didn't understand the gravity of their situation, but because she refused to let it define her. Empire Industries was transformed when they arrived. FBI vehicles surrounding the perimeter, security personnel at every entrance, the routine of corporate life, suspended by the gravity of ongoing revelations. Elizabeth met them in the lobby, her composed exterior barely concealing the tension beneath. The archive contained far more than we anticipated, she told Thomas as they rode the elevator to a secure conference room. Not just corporate espionage, but evidence of decades of unauthorized back-channel diplomacy. The State Department and intelligence agencies are now involved. And Abigail, Thomas asked. Cooperating, apparently, claims she was recruited during law school, told she was working for a private intelligence firm supporting national security. Elizabeth's expression hardened. Whether she believed that or was simply following orders for personal advancement remains to be determined. In the conference room, they found Robert Franklin and Maria Bay already assembled, along with federal agents and intelligence analysts. The atmosphere was one of controlled urgency, a major operation unfolding with methodical precision. An FBI agent named Peterson approached Thomas. Dr. Miller will need your complete statement regarding the archive discovery and your wife's file. But first, I want to assure you that your daughter will have round-the-clock protection until this situation is fully contained. Thomas appreciated the direct acknowledgement of his primary concern. Thank you. Emily stays with me, though. No separate safe houses. Understood. We've arranged secure quarters here in the building for tonight. Tomorrow we'll establish a more permanent arrangement. As the debriefing proceeded, Thomas learned the full scope of what they had uncovered. Montgomery's archive contained evidence of a 50-year operation that had begun as unauthorized Cold War diplomacy, American industrialists establishing back channels with Soviet counterparts when official relations were frozen, but had evolved into something more complex and corrupted. Technology transfers, market manipulations, and personal enrichment had gradually replaced the original geopolitical motivations. Most disturbing were the personnel files revealing dozens of individuals across multiple industries and government agencies who had been recruited into Montgomery's network. The next generation files showed the operation had been designed for continuity across decades, with new recruits replacing retiring operatives. This extends far beyond Empire Industries, Agent Peterson explained. We're looking at a private intelligence and influence network that operated parallel to official channels for half a century and managed to remain undetected until now, Thomas added, which suggests significant resources and protection. Peterson nodded grimly. That's our assessment as well. Montgomery and Ellison may have been the visible faces within Empire Industries, but they were mid-level figures in the overall structure. Well, the implications were staggering. What had begun as an investigation into manipulated contracts had uncovered a shadow operation spanning decades and crossing international boundaries. And somehow, Thomas Miller, janitor, linguistics professor, single father, had become the key to exposing it all. As the evening wore on, Emily eventually fell asleep on a couch in the corner of the conference room, emotionally exhausted by the day's events. Thomas continued working with the federal team, providing translations of Russian and Chinese documents found in the archive, identifying linguistic patterns that help map connections between operatives. Near midnight, Elizabeth joined him at a table covered with document photographs and translation notes. She looked as tired as he felt, the weight of institutional betrayal evident in her posture. The board has been briefed, she said quietly. They're in shock, of course. Learning that your family company was used as cover for espionage and unauthorized diplomacy for 3 generations isn't easy to process. Will Empire Industries survive this? Thomas asked. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Yes, though not unchanged. We'll face investigations, oversight, restructuring, but the company itself is more than Montgomery's operation. Thousands of employees who knew nothing about any of this producing legitimate products supporting this community. She glanced toward Emily, sleeping peacefully despite the turmoil surrounding her. She's remarkable, your daughter. After everything she's been through today, learning about her mother being targeted, witnessing a high-speed chase, she was helping our analysts organize file photographs earlier, said she has a system for pattern recognition. Thomas smiled despite his exhaustion. She's always been resilient, gets that from her mother. And her father, Elizabeth added. Most people would have broken under what you've endured these past years. Instead, you rebuilt your life around what mattered most, your daughter, and then found the strength to expose a conspiracy that professionals missed for decades. I was just doing my job, Thomas replied with deliberate irony. Cleaning up messes others left behind. Elizabeth chuckled softly at his janitor reference. The offer still stands, you know. Vice President of Global Compliance and Ethics. Though I understand if recent events have changed your perspective. Thomas considered the offer anew, watching Emily sleep. While federal agents worked around them, the worlds of corporate power and international espionage colliding in ways he could never have imagined when he first applied for a maintenance position at Empire Industries. I'll accept, he said finally, but with conditions: complete autonomy for Eagle Eye, authority to investigate any aspect of company operations without prior approval, and a schedule that accommodates Emily's needs first. Done, Elizabeth agreed without hesitation. The board will ratify it tomorrow. She hesitated, then added, there's something else. The prosecutors believe they can make a case for first-degree murder in Sarah's death. They want to know if you'd prefer they pursue that charge or accept a plea agreement that would guarantee Montgomery and his associates remain imprisoned for life. The question struck at Thomas's core, his desire for justice conflicting with practical considerations. A murder trial would mean public exposure, Emily testifying, reliving the most painful chapter of their lives in exquisite detail. What would Sarah want, he asked himself aloud. Justice, certainly, but not at Emily's expense. There's time to decide, Elizabeth assured him. For now, focus on keeping Emily safe and helping the investigation identify everyone involved in Montgomery's network. Thomas nodded, his gaze returning to the documents before him. Fragments of a conspiracy that had claimed his wife's life and nearly destroyed the company he now worked for. The linguistics professor in him saw patterns in the chaos, connections in the seemingly disparate pieces. The janitor in him recognized the meticulous work required to clean up decades of corruption. The father in him understood that protecting Emily meant creating systems that prevented such abuses from recurring. All these facets of his identity, once compartmentalized by grief and necessity, now integrated into a singular purpose, truth-telling that mattered. As dawn broke over Millbrook, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, Thomas watched Emily stir from sleep. Her eyes found his immediately, a moment of disorientation giving way to remembrance of their circumstances. "Morning, Dad," she said, sitting up and pushing hair from her face. "Did you solve the conspiracy yet?" Thomas smiled at her resilience. "Working on it. Might take more than one night." Emily nodded sagely. "The important ones always do." She looked around the room, taking in the federal agents, the document-covered tables, the technological array tracking Montgomery's network in real time. "So this is your new job, finding bad guys hiding in paperwork." "Something like that," Thomas acknowledged. "What do you think?" Emily considered the question with surprising seriousness. "I think Mom would be proud, and I think it's better than cleaning floors." She paused, then added with teenage directness, "Does it pay more because I really want a new telescope?" Thomas laughed, the sound surprising him with its authenticity. Even here, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and danger, Emily could anchor him to what mattered: the simple, profound joy of being her father. "Yes," he assured her, "it pays more. Telescope fund approved." In the weeks that followed, Thomas and the Eagle Eye team worked alongside federal investigators to map the full extent of Montgomery's network. The operation expanded beyond Millbrook, beyond Pennsylvania, beyond even American borders, a web of influence and information trafficking that had operated in the shadows of legitimate business for decades. Empire Industries underwent painful but necessary transformation, with Elizabeth leading efforts to rebuild institutional integrity while preserving the company's core functions. The board, once skeptical of Eagle Eye's purpose, now championed its mission, recognizing that ethical governance wasn't just morally right, but essential for survival. Thomas and Emily moved to a new apartment, not fleeing, but upgrading to a space that better reflected their changing circumstances. Emily's new room had a bay window perfect for her telescope. Thomas converted the second bedroom into a home office where he could work when Emily needed him nearby. One evening, as autumn painted Millbrook in rust and gold, Thomas stood on their small balcony, watching the sun set behind the Empire Industries building in the distance. Emily joined him, telescope in hand. "Saturn's visible tonight," she announced. "Want to see?" Thomas helped her set up the telescope, following her expert instructions with paternal pride. As she adjusted the focus, he marveled at how she had emerged from tragedy not broken, but tempered stronger in the wounded places like well-forged steel. "Dad," she said as she stepped back to let him look through the eyepiece, "do you think we'll ever know everything about what happened? About Mom and all of it?" Thomas peered through the telescope, Saturn's rings coming into perfect clarity against the darkening sky. "Probably not everything," he admitted. "Some secrets stay buried. But we know the truth that matters most, that your mother was brave, that she was pursuing something important, and that her work helped expose wrongdoing that had been hidden for generations." Emily considered this, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. "Like archaeology, right? You never find every piece of the past, but you find enough to understand the story." "Exactly like that," Thomas agreed, struck by the aptness of her metaphor. "And sometimes understanding the story is more important than having every detail." They stood in companionable silence, watching as stars emerged above Millbrook, the same stars that had witnessed 5 decades of hidden operations: Sarah's last drive home, Thomas's years of anonymous labor, and now their new beginning. "I've decided what I want to be," Emily announced suddenly, "an investigative journalist like Mom, but specializing in scientific fraud and corporate misconduct." Thomas felt a moment of parental concern, knowing firsthand the dangers of such work, followed by deep pride in her choice. "Your mother would be honored," he said, "and a little worried, just like I am." Emily rolled her eyes. "I'll be careful. I'll learn languages like you so I can read the documents no one else bothers to translate. And I'll work with people I trust, like your Eagle Eye team." "That sounds like a solid plan," Thomas acknowledged. "But you have a few years to figure out the details. Focus on 8th grade science first." "Already acing it," she replied with characteristic confidence. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Thomas sat in his home office reviewing case files from the ongoing investigation. Montgomery and Ellison remained in federal custody, both facing multiple life sentences. Abigail Foster had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for identifying other network members. The Silo archive had yielded evidence leading to arrests across several industries and government agencies. Yet Thomas knew the work was far from complete. Networks this sophisticated didn't collapse entirely when exposed. They adapted, reformed, continued in new configurations. Vigilance would be required for years to come. His phone rang, Elizabeth calling with an update on the latest board meeting. As they discussed the implementation of new compliance protocols, Thomas found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. From prestigious academic to anonymous janitor to corporate executive and federal witness, a path no career counselor could have predicted. After the call ended, Thomas opened his desk drawer and removed a photograph he kept there, Sarah holding newborn Emily, her expression radiant with the particular joy of new motherhood. For years, he had avoided looking at such images, the pain too acute to bear. Now he found comfort in remembering her as she had been brilliant, principled, alive with purpose. "We found the truth, Sarah," he said softly to the photograph. "Not all of it, but enough to matter, enough for justice." The investigation would continue. Montgomery's network would be dismantled. Empire Industries would rebuild. Millbrook might even revitalize as the company renewed its commitment to the community. And through it all, Thomas and Emily would move forward, not forgetting the past, but refusing to be defined by its darkest chapters. In the quiet of his new home, surrounded by evidence of both conspiracy and renewal, Thomas recognized the paradoxical truth of his journey. Only by becoming invisible had he learned to truly see. Only by losing everything had he discovered what could never be taken away. Only by cleaning floors had he found the perspective needed to cleanse something far more significant. The janitor who saved an empire. The father who protected his daughter. The scholar who decoded a conspiracy. The widower who honored his wife's memory by continuing her pursuit of truth. All these identities, once fractured by grief, now integrated into the man who sat in a modest home office in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, watching over his sleeping daughter while planning tomorrow's work, the ongoing labor of making truth matter in a world that often preferred comfortable lies. Outside his window, Empire Industries stood illuminated against the night sky, its lights no longer symbols of power beyond his reach, but beacons of responsibility he had chosen to bear. And beside it, the stars continued their ancient patterns, witnessing another chapter in the human story unfold. A chapter about buried secrets brought to light, about invisible men, becoming seen, about truth emerging from the shadows to claim its rightful place in the order of things.